time for our first panel, and this panel is going to be in leadership and security. It's going to run for about 40 minutes, I believe. So I would like to now invite our panelists to the stage. First of all, we have Dr. Anino Emuwa, founder and managing director of Avandis Consulting. Let's give them a warm welcome. And then we have Miss Fadzayi Mahere, who is the advocate of the High Court and Supreme Court of Zimbabwe. And then we have Dr. Justice Tankebe, Associate Professor of Criminology here at University of Cambridge. And then joining us virtually, we have Dr. Solomon Ayele Dersso, who's the founding director of Amani, Africa Media and Research Services in Addis Ababa. You can have a virtual round of applause. And then we have our moderator for this panel, who is Stephen Boabeng Bedu, Masters of Law, University of Cambridge, Chevening Scholar for the year 2021, and Associate African Union Office of the Legal Counsel. So this is going to be a panel followed by a time for Q&A as well. So I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you once again for joining us for today's panel. It is a pleasure to see so many young and youth-adjacent Africans and persons of African descent gathered here at Cambridge. You know, I often commented, at least in at the beginning of my tenure here at Cambridge, that one was more likely to discover unicorns than to see African students. And I'm happy to see that today, at least with all of us gathered here today, some of those beliefs are being, should we say, challenged. Nevertheless, I would like to welcome you all. This is the first panel for today's conference on leadership and security. As has already been introduced, I am joined by an esteemed and distinguished panel of experts, both in government, in civil society, and in academia, to discuss one of the most pressing issues facing our continent. But before we delve into questions of leadership and the likes, I think it's first important to try and contextualize this discussion. And we start first by maybe interrogating the broader theme for today's conference, because there are a number of assumptions that this theme makes. Africa's re-emergence assumes a number of things that, well, Africa used to occupy a prior position of prominence that we have somehow lost and that we should return to, and that it is indeed the duty of us, the best and brightest minds of our continent, at least according to the Selection Committee of Cambridge, to help Africa re-emerge once again. And I think the first question I would like to pose to Ms. Fadzayi is, well, if you're talking about Africa's re-emergence, where is Africa re-emerging from? And if we are to take back control, who are we taking control back from?
Thank you very much, Stephen, and I have to say it's a privilege to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I will say I'm from the great nation of Zimbabwe, so that will give you a bit of context. Now, just coming straight to the question posed by Stephen, it's a huge assumption to say Africa is re-emerging. I'm going to force us into a bit of a courageous and honest conversation that really forces us to think about where we really stand as a continent. Obviously, we're proud to be African, but we're not proud of where our continent and our countries are right now. We face some of the highest unemployment, poverty, and poor economic development stats in the world. And it's not true that we've necessarily ever been top of the food chain, so to speak, but there is something that has changed for the worse. There is something that we were very strong at in the past, and that has declined, and that is to do with our mindset. Now, when Africans were fighting colonialism, there was a huge, pan-African fight, a sense of pride around being African, a sense of let's come together. You know, when the OAU was formed, there was a sense of, let's all come together. And we had great statesmen. We had Mahere, we had, who else? Nkrumah. Who else? I'm not going to say Robert Mugabe for obvious reasons, but I think you get the point. We had these great thinkers who had a big vision and a big plan for the Africa that they wanted to build. And the enemy at the time was the colonial project. After that was done, there was a sort of dip in the thinking. There wasn't a plan of, now we've attained independence, how do we grow? How do we prosper? How do we start to come first? How do we start making the African citizen win? And I think that's where, the project fell apart. There was a slight reemergence when Thabo Mbeki of South Africa, as you know, started talking about the African Renaissance. There was a little bit of, more of the Africa Rising sort of talk, but all of that now has completely fallen away. We don't have any visionary African leaders who are talking about how we take the continent as a whole forward, how we start to come first, how we start to make Africa work for African citizens. Instead, we've got more coups. Instead, we have a lot more poverty. I mean, it's a matter of huge embarrassment that 49% of the Zimbabwean population live in extreme poverty. This is the country that in 1980, Julius Nyerere, I believe it was, said, this is a jewel, don't destroy it. We all know the story. So there's a need to obviously take control back. Now, I think the big challenge we face now is that the person we need to take control back from is not a big white colonialist. It's an African who looks just like us. It's an authoritarian leader who will kill, who will maim, who will rape. Public hospitals in Zimbabwe don't have a single cancer machine. That's embarrassing. A single cancer machine. Our maternal mortality rate is the highest it's been ever. Access to education remains under constant threat. There is a need to take the country back, and who does that? It has to be the citizen. The most important office in governance and leadership is the office of the citizen. And until African citizens start to reclaim their power, I was just saying to Stephen before we started, there's no such thing as rock bottom in Africa. Things can always get worse. I mean, you know the tales of hyperinflation in Zimbabwe in 2008. How do you have a $200 trillion note that can buy you ice cream? There's no such thing as rock bottom, so we should never ever take it for granted. And until citizens look at their circumstances and say, we're better than this, we need to do better. And I just want to say in closing, because I've already spoken a lot, the keynote speaker who just spoke delivered a fantastic presentation. I was inspired at every turn. The sad reality, however, is that most young Africans don't have the luxury of those conversations. That is not what occupies their mind at the moment. 90% of Zimbabweans are unemployed, never held a job, never held a formal job. And I'm not counting, obviously, selling bananas on the side of the street. We all know that's not employment in the true sense. Until we can start to make Africa work for Africans through installing ethical leadership by using our power as the people, we won't have the luxury to talk of climate change. Not because it's not something that affects us, but because we need to put food on the table. We are worried about our dignity. You're worried about getting beaten up by the police. How in 2021-22 Zimbabwe is a woman thrown into prison for a tweet against police brutality? How is that happening? It's just simply unacceptable. And if we are to re-emerge or to emerge at all, we really have to take back control from those gory men in power, and it is predominantly men, strong men who have run the continent down, if we're to be completely honest. Whether you talk of North Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa, you know, Africa's story is a little bit of a single story, and that really needs to change.
Thank you. Commissioner Dersso, as a commissioner of the African Union, or rather, as a commissioner of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, I'm sure Ms. Fadzayi made a number of statements that may have struck a nerve, chief amongst which is this idea that there is a kind of ideological deficit, that we have departed from some form of ideological prominence to a state in which our leaders are motivated by no particular vision, and more so by a sense of patronage, a sense of entitlement and the likes. Having operated within the highest realms of regional African politics, how do you respond to a number of the statements that she has made?
Thank you very much, Stephen. I would like to first of all thank the organizers of this event for the kind invitation extended to me. And I was hoping that you wouldn't bring out my other hat, since I'm since I'm here in my capacity as founding director of Amani Africa, which is a policy research, training and consulting think tank that works on multilateral processes on African affairs, with a particular focus on governance and peace and security. I fully agree with the submissions that have been made. I think the leadership crisis that we face today is first and foremost indeed a crisis of leadership of ideas. There is not just a question of ideological deficit, but actually the absence of any ideological conviction and belief. Obviously, this is not unique to Africa. I think it is a phenomenon that cuts across the world. That is why today many, even in the developed world, are disenchanted with the absence of a difference between Democrats and Republicans, Labour and Conservative. Whichever way electorates choose, basically all of these are in the middle. They are in the service not of the electorate, but global finance and economic actors. And there is clearly, globally, a collapse of ideology as we know it. But in a context like Africa, such a collapse becomes very dire in terms of its consequences. Because without such very serious vision and clarity of purpose anchored on a clear understanding of the challenge of the continent, and those challenges require first and foremost that clarity of ideas and purpose, which is a matter of ideology. And that is why I think in some sense when we talk about the issue of today's leaders the weakness of today's leaders, we are making a comparison to the visions and incredible political imagination of leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and those who stand along him, Julius Nyerere and the like. They had not only a clear understanding of the trinity of burden that Africa weighs on Africa, I mean, the burden of history, first and foremost, the burden, importantly, of the very difficult international environment in which Africa is put at the bottom of the pyramid of global development, and the burden also of course, institutional and governance deficit that afflicts the continent. And it is based on this that they have managed to articulate an incredible vision. If you read Kwame Nkrumah's Africa Must Unite, you would end up feeling that whatever it is that today we are struggling with has been articulated in an incredible depth, richness, and imagination that we, as the continent, have not been able to follow through. And therefore, indeed, the ideological leadership deficit, first and foremost, is a problem. We have today only transactional leaders that actually end up, selling for the highest bidder, so to speak, anything. All right, not the so-called national interest is no more national interest in the way that it is traditionally understood. So it is in this context that you would appreciate the enormous importance of leadership, because when you have a visionary leadership, it's not simply that they provide the space for mobilizing ideas into policies and programs, but also have the dexterity and the determination and the backbone to stand up to any pressure that comes from any quarter in terms of following through with those plans. And there are experiences from the continent that show that. And even in terms of, for example, one of the things that's extremely important in any governance system is the question of risk assessment and planning, whether it is climate change or any other thing, whether it is COVID-19. In our engagement on COVID-19, for example, one of the first things that we said was, look, part of the reason why many people on the continent are left vulnerable has to do with a failure of leadership and governance on the continent, because there was no leadership that ensured investment in social services, water, sanitation, access to healthcare. It's only when the crisis hits that we see some countries scrambling and saying that now we are going to establish 100 clinics. You know, Stephen, who said this. I'm sure it must be from your country, right? It is this kind of, absence that we are talking about. And of course, in Africa, many countries do have structural vulnerabilities. And structural vulnerabilities that may actually easily become combustible and end up creating crisis, including conflict. And what makes the difference in making sure that these situations do not indeed push countries into crisis is leadership. There are countries that have gone up in flames exactly because of the choices that leaders make, reducing everything into a zero-sum game in which without them, everything can burn down. And therefore, you have fires breaking up and countries being consumed by violent, brutal conflict. And this is a question of leadership. And the lack of really political imagination and the absence of willingness for a politics of compromise and inclusivity. And these are the manifestations of the deficit of leadership that we are talking about. And I'm sure there are other questions that would come further to explain and show why we are in a difficult time and environment, why leadership is so crucial in responding to these issues and challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dersso, for that illuminating exposition on the kind of transactional nature of African leaders. I will try to hold myself from referring to you as Commissioner Dersso. As my former boss, I'm quite accustomed to referring to you in that manner. But I think what we've discussed so far has been, I would argue, at quite an academic and theoretical level. The everyday African cannot compare the various magnum opuses, because I don't think Nkrumah has a single one. He has multiple, to, let's say, some kind of ideological deficit existing in present-day Ghanaian or other African leaders. For the everyday African, lack of leadership is exhibited in the rise in fuel prices, the inability to access healthcare services and the likes. However, when the everyday African considers that Africa has indeed not re-emerged, there is an idea that the everyday African compares Africa to. And I fear that in many instances that idea is quite Western. That idea is motivated by a sense of Western universalism. This idea that Africa follows, the West leads. And a question I want to ask you, Dr. Anino, is whether or not this is indeed the case. Does Africa follow? Does the West lead? And if we have a vision for Africa's re-emergence, is it steeped in a Western notion of development? Or is there an alternative mode of development that we are exploring currently, or that we can explore, and which we can then present to our people?
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much to the African Society for inviting me here today. Excuse me, my voice is a little bit hoarse, so I might have to stop and drink water intermittently. And thank you to Professor Rego for the introduction and all the speakers who have gone before me. Now, can you hear? You can't hear. Let's move that. How is that? Better? Okay. The first thing is that the notion of leadership is changing rapidly. And it's an issue which is complex in the world we're seeing today. If we take two countries, for example, mentioned by the previous speaker, for example, in the US, and talking about the Republicans, right? And how the notion of understanding what those, shall we say, the ideological concepts are changing very rapidly. In the country where I live in right now, in France, for example, what we saw at the last elections was that the leading party and President Macron's party is a party that only came up in existence in the last elections, just before the last elections, so about 5 years ago. And the previous two parties actually scored very small, I think 5% and 7%, right? So the concepts we've had about political ideology are rapidly changing, and the West is finding problems with that. And so there's no way in any form or fashion that Africa can possibly be looking at the Western models, because even those are under threat. What we see is that people are immensely educated by the knowledge about the things that they need. They might not have that formal education, but they know exactly what they need. And this is what leaders have to deal with, right? People are not voting according to some ideological belief. They are voting according to where they think, or what they think that they, what party or what person can give them what they require. That is not ideology, right? That is actually some kind of practicality, shall we say. Because the issues that are facing our continent, right, as many countries and other, not just a continent, other countries in the world are fundamental. We have this cleavage, this massive cleavage that is growing and rising between the extremely wealthy and extreme poverty. People are aware of the situation and they're aware of the status. And what they're asking, and which is why we see low rates very often of voting, because people are saying, what am I going to get out of this? Because they cannot see leadership as providing the things that they need. So I think we have to re-examine that and look at that and say, what does leadership mean in terms of what do people need and what do people want? We really have to re-examine that notion, and that is where we are in the world today. You mentioned, of course, that during the period of COVID, we had a slide in, sadly, in democracy in Africa. But I come from a positive perspective. We've set the scene, and we're looking into the future. And you will all let me know, I can't remember who said this, never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yes.
And this leadership crisis we're talking about is a leadership opportunity. And even if we are not solving the issues today, we will solve them in the future. And what we're talking about today, I think, is putting the foundation to solving those problems. And the foundation, this is a microcosm of that foundation in this room. That is to say that the leaders we have today, in terms of political leadership, if we look at Africa with the youngest population in the world, we actually find we have the oldest leadership in the world, actually. The average leadership is probably around 62, but there's quite a big gap. The top leaders are probably in their 80s. Now, these leaders were actually born before our countries became independent. There's going to be a massive leadership demographic shift in the next 20 years as the young people today become the leaders of tomorrow. And these are leaders who have grown up in the context of technology, right? In the context of a more shared system of outcomes, of values, right? A more collaborative way of working through the internet, through technology. And I think that we are going to see that phenomenal shift. That's my prediction in the next 20 years for leadership in Africa.
Dr. Justice Tankebe, Dr. Anino makes a very interesting point about this kind of demographic shift in the composition of African leaders. And I think as Africans, we have a hope that there will be a replacement of the old guard with the so-called new guard. Having been involved in student governance on various student campuses, I can say with a certain measure of authority that the youth may not be our hope. I think at times, if one were to do an analysis of corruption at the student governance level, vis-a-vis even corruption at government level, we might find that the young people are outdoing the old guard. And you have a very interesting research field. Namely, you study the corruption of prospective elites in Ghana. And so I would like to ask you really, when we consider the potential threats or strength of Africa's young population, what role do you think they can really play in shifting this ideological deficit in African leadership and in presenting a new economic model for Africans?
Okay, you're quite a pessimist, aren't you? Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. And I completely share the views that were articulated earlier. And I think the reference to Nkrumah always reminded me of something that he said, which was that one of the many things he said, which was that Africa belonged to Africans. And I always thought about that in terms of just the resources that Africa has, resources that, of course, colonialism, slave trade, and so forth exploited, but also political institutions that we felt represented us, answered our questions, were accountable to us. But unfortunately, of course, what we've seen is dispossession in terms of corruption and the work by multinational corporations. We've also seen political institutions that are not accountable to us. And I think if you are a young person today, that's what some of them are exposed to. So it's not a great example that is being said to many young people. And one of the things we sought to do in the various studies that we've done was to try to just to see whether young people were in any way having values that were more ethical, that were more committed to democratic governance and so forth. At least on the data that I have, I wouldn't say that most of them are in the way that you sought to paint them. I think we had, of course, we were surprised that up to about 40% of the young people that we study were predisposed to engage in corrupt transactions and so forth. But I think when you look at it, some of the factors that explain this is this weakening attachment to the state, right? What political scientists will call democratic consolidation, right? That is weakening. They don't think that the state represents them. The state speaks to their needs, answers their questions, and so forth. So I think if we want the youth to take up the leadership that we're thinking about handing down to them, I think one way we can do that is to begin to tackle some of the issues that has already been highlighted. And these are issues of unaccountable power, issues of corruption, issues of dissipation of resources. In effect, we're really handing over to them nothing in that respect if we don't take those measures. So I will not place the responsibility so much on the youth. I would think that they are a resource, and that's the way that they've often been conceived. They are a resource. Of course, when we look at the security situation in West Africa with terrorism, ISIS, and so forth, of course, the youth are those who are predominantly engaged in this. They are not in that because I think that's the option that they consider to be viable for them. They are being led into this because of disillusionment, because of its enfranchisement that colleagues have already indicated. So from where I stand, I think there is hope, but it's a hope that requires us to begin to build the kind of institutions that I think, if you look even traditionally in African societies, were institutions that answered to local communities, were institutions that sought to, as far as possible, share resources in the ways that benefited local communities. And I think the more we do that, the more we set to the youth an example about the kind of concept that Archbishop Desmond Tutu was talking about.
Thank you. I think to do something differently, it seems we have 5 minutes. I was under the impression that we had 15 minutes. I may have been wrong. So beyond the youth dimension, there's also a kind of gender dimension. And I think I'll pose this to Dr. Dersso. Ms. Fadzayi made a comment about men being predominantly responsible for the various issues we are discussing today. And we know that Agenda 2063 prioritizes this idea of gender parity, gender equality, and the likes. representation across the board. Why have we not achieved this? And what can we learn from nations such as Rwanda, which have made giant strides in this regard?
So let me start by, you asked the question of the possibility of Africa having a new and different development paradigm. I think I would like to ask to pause and ask this question. This assumes that Africa has the policy space that makes it possible for African countries to exercise fully self-determination in choosing the path to development. And I wonder if that assumption is accurate and realistic. We live in a world, as I indicated earlier on, in which the economic relationship of the continent is wired in such a way that it is put under, basically at the bottom of the pyramid as a source of incredible resources that fuels the development of the world. But in return, basically, not much happens, right? I think the question of policy space is so crucial if Africa is indeed going to articulate a path different from the path that has been taken so far. At the end of the day, I think the question is really partly, I think we have to really debate the importance of ideology. I don't know if the kind of development that we aspire that would really reinstate and indeed affirm the dignity of every African, other human being, and therefore removing the shackles of socioeconomic impoverishment that was mentioned earlier on, enabling active participation in decision making, and therefore reclaiming the control that has been made reference to. And in all of this, I think it's extremely important to bring to the center of our debate the whole question of the importance of ideology. I don't know if in the absence of ideology, or basically it may not be a complete absence of ideology, but an ideology of a globally governing type, that is one, that is basically at the service of financial capital. I think if that is, then of course, I fully understand, but that is not the type of ideology that obviously would affirm the dignity of particularly Africans and people of color the world over, and the importance therefore of the whole question of the centrality of ideology that needs to be debated as part of this question of whether and how Africa can indeed articulate and pursue a development path that is part and parcel of its exercise of agency and self-determination. To your question on the question of gender, I think the example that you mentioned, that of Rwanda, is a testament to the fact that it is really a matter of political will and commitment that makes the kind of women representation in various layers of decision making, not just in parliament, but in other sectors, even at the lower level of structure of government. It is the political commitment and vision, and indeed the leadership that comes with it, that made that possible. More often than not, if this, commitment is not accompanied by a recognition, first, that our dominant political, social and economic structures and processes are heavily steeped in patriarchy. And that requires actually a reordering on its own. That this actually strips women of their dignity and the possibility of their recognition as agents in themselves, capable of participating. And the fact that these also deprive societies of the enormous contribution that women make. Women already make incredible contribution. And it's only when we are faced with crisis in our communities, in our families, that we realize the incredible resourcefulness of women in enabling us in weathering those crises. And you can imagine the kind of, how patriarchy has, basically deprived us as societies of the possibilities for doing that. So at some level, I think there are a number of things that need to be done in this respect. But first and foremost, political commitment and leadership is very critical. And the recognition of the inherent dignity of women, that they have a right to live a life of dignity, free from oppression and violence, has to be central and front, the basis on which now we, roll out changing mindset and social practices that is so crucial in order to ensure that gender equality is achieved. It's also important in terms of planning of social services and the rolling out of those social services. The importance of the role of women there, whether it is in healthcare, whether it is in education, and therefore enabling young girls to have access to education, whether it is ultimately in the labor market. So
thank you, Dr. Dersso. In the last few minutes that we have, at least for this session, I think it might be important to then maybe tackle this last element of security and some of the security threats that are posed. And I'll direct this last questions to both Ms. Fadzayi and Dr. Amino, and about what do you feel are Africa's biggest peace and security threats, and are these threats adequately addressed through current development initiatives? Having spoken with Dr. Anino, I understand that you have a particularly unique take on this, and I think it would be important for our audience to hear this.
Thank you. I think that when we talk about Africa's, the security threats, there's a tendency to think of the classic, okay? But the other things that we need to really think about, and even Professor Vergen mentioned in the opening, one, when you talk about the issues to do with, for example, terrorism, and then you look at the actions to combat terrorism, which have very often been military, which it's classic. However, what are some of the causes? Some of the causes are actually climate. The climate change in the Sahel region. And climate change has become a narrative which is sort of, in today's world. I remember as a child looking at the map of Africa and seeing that green belt slowly decreasing. Okay, so we've been aware of climate change matters for decades. Now, when you have a whole, the Sahel and what's happening in the Chad Basin and reduction of Lake Chad, it's now less than 90% of what it was. These are all economic issues. So we have really strong economic issues to deal with. We also have, of course, the proliferation of uncontrolled arms from conflicts, which are being used, which are there as well. So we have climate change, we have arms which are in there, we have poverty, and importantly, education. When you do not have education, or you have youth population that is not sufficiently educated and they don't see access to opportunities, that is fueling really security issues. So those are the additional issues that I wanted to bring out that we need to be clear about. And also, another thing that I would say in an African context is that when we're looking at peace and security, we should be looking at peace and security from our context, right? Not the context of the Western world. And what do I mean about that? For example, migration. It's one of the biggest threats to the advanced and developed world. That's not really our issue. Our issue is to provide opportunities for our people and not to look at what the threats are to the Western world. It's not that we don't live in a communal, collaborative world. We do. But we also need to make sure that we are protecting the interests of our people as well. So economic opportunity, education, climate change, some of those are key additional factors that we need to be looking at.
I do want to focus on the classic ones, if I may, and I think, some of the biggest security threats we have is the increasing militarization of our governments, the extreme use of force by governments, especially on the citizens. Look at what took place in Nigeria with NSARS. A Nigerian is more likely to be killed by a Nigerian military officer or police officer, than any other, external security threat. I mean, we look at what happened in Zimbabwe, 2018, post-election violence by the military, citizens shot in cold blood. This was repeated in January 2019, where people are protesting against the rising fuel crisis. The army is unleashed onto the people, and people are just shot at random with no accountability. And so I think we really need to address that. Look at the crisis in the Tigray region. Again, it's your own governments. Internal armed conflict in Africa is becoming a huge problem. And so we need to look at this. Tribal tensions, ethnic tensions are something that we need to continue to keep an eye on. It is a vulnerability in the African context. So we mustn't forget those old classic threats as we look to solve the emerging ones. And I have to say that at the core of it, we have to sort out the leadership crisis. We can have fancy conferences, we can come to Cambridge, and I did come here, Professor Virgo, thank you for the beautiful education. We can travel, we can write nice books, we can do amazing research, but when you go back home, and I realized this when I went back home, when I moved back in 2011, until we resolve the leadership crisis, you can have the fanciest LLM from Cambridge. It comes to naught if your leader does not care, does not put the citizens first, is not interested. You can have all these ideas around constitutionalism, your free speech rights, your free assembly, and so on. If the leader does not believe that, you are on a hiding to hell, and I say this with all due respect. And I think this is something that resonates across the continent, from South Africa to all the way up to Egypt. We really need to sort out the leadership issue. And if you follow me on Twitter, full disclosure, I'm a politician. I'm the spokesperson of the main opposition in Zimbabwe, and I have to say that every single time I look at the crises within Zimbabwe and outside, I always end by saying we need new leaders. And not necessarily young leaders, because ethical leadership is not about age. It's not about tribe. It's not about class. Ethical leadership is just a brand new way of doing politics. A politics that puts the people first, that encourages active citizenry. A startling statistic is that Zimbabwe has enough gold deposits to make every single Zimbabwean a millionaire. That's a crazy stat. It's a crazy stat. Zimbabwe at the same time loses $100 million every single month to illicit financial flows in gold, illicit gold deals. So you can see that Zimbabwe is not poor, it's poorly managed. And so with the right leaders, you start to solve all these problems. And so even when it comes to security, you want leaders who are not going to shoot you for speaking truth to power. You want leaders who are going to stop stealing, and by the way, Zimbabwe loses $2 billion a year at least, according to official data, to corruption. This is the same country that I told you does not have a single radiotherapy machine in any of the public hospitals. that has a minimum wage of 22 US dollars a month for domestic staff. That's less than $1 a day if you're a gardener in Zimbabwe. That tells you something has gone wrong. That's why when people speak up, they're not afraid to just use a gun, and I'm glad. I will call you Commissioner. The African Union has great ideas around the silencing of the guns. And yet when force is used on citizens, they are disastrously silent. It's not just about ideology, it's about practical steps. And actually, you know, regardless of what your ideology is, you have to be able to have a leadership that puts the people first. And I'll just close by using the example of Zimbabwe again. ZANU-PF, the party led by Robert Mugabe in 1980, had one of the strongest ideological foundations. Marxist in ideology. I mean, some say the red star on the Zimbabwean flag is that ode to Marxism. It's very strong ideology, but that never translated into improving the lot of the Zimbabwean people. So if you've got strong ideology with that deficit of care, I don't care what your ideology is, you have to care about the people. Have they eaten? Do they have access to education? Can they access quality healthcare when they fall sick? Do they have basic services? Are you committing enough funds to infrastructure? All those things come down to leadership. So we need new leaders.
Thank you so much. Before we go into the final portion, Q&A, I just wanted to give Dr. Justice, the opportunity to speak on this. Both, Fadzayi and the others made a very important comment. Ms. Fadzayi noted that she did something that many of the students here may not do. She went back home. She went back home, and considering that you work here at the University of Cambridge, you technically have not gone back home. What role do you feel that both the African diaspora play in this whole issue, in improving African leadership? And can we truly improve African leadership or affect these issues if we essentially stay abroad? If we work at the University of Cambridge rather than the University of Ghana? And if we have firms in France rather than firms in our home countries?
We have an office in Nigeria.
I try to be spicy. What role really do you think those things will play?
Okay, no, don't worry, I'll go. Okay. No, I think, first of all, to again share with the ideas that have been articulated, I think one of the major threats to security is, of course, corruption, the unaccountable power that we have on the continent. And but I think when it comes to leadership, I feel that we often focus on individuals rather than thinking about building institutions. Institutions that, of course, what we've seen on the continent is you get leaders that speak what we want to hear when they are in opposition. I mean, that's not you're not the one I have. No. But in power just seems to somehow change them in a way. Or at least they were already people that we didn't quite know. So I think one thing to consider is building institutions that at least when we have bad leaders who get in, they are not able to worsen the situation that we already find ourselves in. So that's the first thing I would say. But I think in terms of making an input back home, of course, we've seen that with technology, we are able to do that. One doesn't have to be physically there. We have seen the examples of many young people who are located abroad for various reasons and are able to make significant input in mobilizing young people to bring change, to hold power to account. So that's really, because of time, that's really what I would say. That I don't think being outside is necessarily an impediment to making a contribution, to mobilizing young people, to doing the kind of things that we've seen them do globally, that has an effect back home on the continent. Yeah.
Thank you. And with that, we essentially close this initial portion of the discussion. I'm being told by the President that we have the opportunity for 2 questions. So if anybody has questions for the panel, you can direct it at any member of the panel, or you can just ask an open question. It seems we have more than 2 questions. As you know, leadership on Africa is a big issue. So, yes, so we'll first take 3 questions, and then maybe if there are others, and we will take I think said the lady in red first. I don't know if our speakers would like to note them, but I mean these are Cambridge level, so they will memorize the question. Please.
Oh, thank you so much. My question really is, thank you. So my name is Judwin, I'm Cameroonian. My question really is directed, to all the members, so anyone who can really answer the question. So I'm Cameroonian. Cameroon is one of the poorest countries in the world, and Cameroon sits in a region, the CEMAC region, which is one of the worst regions, I think maybe the worst region in the world. So we're saying all these things about what we, the citizens, can do, what we Africans can do to better our countries. But I feel like, so the CEMAC region, the Central African countries, they are the former, most of them, all of them actually are the former French colonies. So I feel like they are kind of a really forgotten area in Africa. A lot of Africa is going forward. CEMAC regions are sat back. So really pretty much still ruled by France. My president has been in power for 40 years. He can barely walk. Every now and then we hear he's dead, and then we see him reappear. So we don't really know what's happening. The president of the Senate as well is saying he can barely walk. He needs support to walk. So France, like I said, still has a great influence in the Central African countries. And I'm sure some of you may have heard that we still pay a colonial tax to France. My question then is, how do we think? So we're talking about we, the citizens, trying to make Africa work. Unfortunately, there's a group of people who there's only so much they can do. In other French countries, you hear about, so it's a president who's been in power for 40 years, and then his son takes over, and I think that's the same that's going to happen in Cameroon, because we're just waiting for the man to die. People are not really doing much, and there's no motivation, because the moment you have an uprising, it's just military, people dying, and people, and no one not. And France is really much in control of all of this, I believe. France attends all the economic meetings in Africa, and if there's an uprising in any of these countries, France is there. So how do we think these countries can shake off the control of France, is my question.
Thank you. Please, let's try and keep the questions as concise as possible. The next speaker is, I think, Martin.
Thank you. My name is Martin. I'm a PhD student studying genomics at the University of Cambridge, and I'm also the communications chair for the African Society of Cambridge University. My question is concerning the quality of leadership that we have. So in my country, Kenya, we have had some of the best educated leaders. For example, our former cabinet secretary for the National Treasury obtained his degree from Harvard Kennedy School. Our current vice president has a PhD in plant sciences. Regardless, the former cabinet secretary was sacked on corruption charges, having looted billions of shillings from the country. Former vice president was indicted in the ICC, still has cases following him, and is now running for presidency with a very bad ethical record. This implies that despite being very well educated, something is lacking. So my question is, what exactly is missing from this education that would enable very educated leaders to be effective? And also, what role can we play here as very well educated people in ensuring that when we get into the same position, we are not just qualified in terms of our credentials, but also our mindset? Thank you.
Due to restrictions, I apologize, we cannot take any any further questions. But as you know, there will be various networking sessions afterwards, and you'll be able to engage with the various panelists during lunch and the likes. So I mean, 2 questions have been posed. One regarding just the general futility of trying to change the things on our continent, and the other regarding the fact that education has somehow not made us any more or less ethical. I don't know who wants to take it.
Can I just quickly, Martin first, and then I'll come to the young lady from Cameroon.
And please, let's try and keep it.
I will keep it short. You know, if there's anything that Robert Mugabe taught us, it's that being well-spoken, being educated, standing up straight, looking like a statesman, being able to address General Assembly conferences with, you know, huge eloquence does not make one a good leader. Good leadership is not about having a Cambridge degree. It's actually not about education in the formal sense. It is about ethics, having integrity, being accountable, being competent, being credible, being able to put together a team that can actually take the nation forward, having a big idea for your country and ultimately the continent. What Zimbabwe do you want to see in 20 years' time? And unfortunately, Dr. Emuwa, I don't have 20 years to wait for these people to die before, you know, I do think young people need to step up. And that comes now to what the Cameroonian lady said. You know, we cannot afford despair as a continent. We have to choose hope and action. We literally need to say, and I'm sorry, because most people who are in here are probably in the diaspora. It's not enough to watch back, sit on Twitter and say, you guys need to do this, and we literally need to be the change we wish to see in the leadership of our continent and our countries. If we don't participate in politics, we're going to be led by buffoons. We're going to continue to be led by people who are not competent, who are not ethical, who've got no big idea, and we'll be forced to sit in beautiful, hallowed halls of Cambridge, teaching other people of what it should be, but without enough practical action on the ground. We really need to step up. It's nice to be comfortable in the UK. It's nice to, you know, sit in wherever it is we are. But if we don't go back to Zimbabwe, to South Africa, to Nigeria, to Cameroon, the French will keep doing what they're doing. And, you know, the difference between us and the son of that 40-year-old leader is that he is there. He is participating. He's got the courage to participate. And so until people, there are more of us than there are of them. So it's not a question of, can we do it? Are we committed to? Do we want to? Do we actually want to see change? Are we committed to actually seeing transformation on the continent, or is it just something we want to read about in books and, you know, wait another couple of decades? You know, we really need to step up as young Africans and Africans in general who want better for the continent.
Thank you. I get the sense from the fact that we're all nodding that you really conveyed the general sentiments of the panel.
This is how dictatorship starts.
That's also a cop-out based on time. I want to thank our distinguished panelists for a very lively discussion. I want to thank you, the audience, for your involvement. As always, you know, discussions around leadership and security can go on for several days, especially as regards Africa. And I'm quite pleased that we were able to distill these into some final points. I think, to summarize really, there's this whole idea that leadership in Africa is faced with a kind of ideological crisis, and that we as the young people should really start participating, both at home and maybe even abroad, in trying to change this ideological deficit. This means that we need to start engaging in politics more. And so in sum, I guess what we're saying on this panel is what Boris Johnson would like to say to many of us. Go back home. Do not become too complacent here in the West. And as Ms. Fadzayi has articulated quite brilliantly, those we want to leave leadership in Africa are actually in Africa and are ruining our continent. And we are here in so-called ivory towers merely discussing and tweeting about it. Once again, go back home, stay vigilant, and hopefully the leadership and security crisis of the continent will change in our lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you.
Follow the example of Solomon.
Thank you very much to that panel there. I really